My name is Terrell, and I was a Grape Street Crip who survived what became known as the deadliest police raid in South Central history, Operation Iron Fist, a dawn assault that left 12 gang members dead, 37 wounded, and an entire community traumatized forever. What I'm about to tell you will shock you to your core because it's not just about police brutality or gang violence. It's about the night when a routine drug bust turned into an urban warfare massacre that changed policing in Los Angeles forever. On March 23, 2001, over 200 LAPD officers, SWAT teams, and federal agents descended on our neighborhood like an invading army, armed with military-grade weapons and orders to take no prisoners. I was 19 years old, trapped in a house with 11 other Crips, facing a police force that had been given permission to use lethal force against anyone who resisted. If you think you know what police raids look like, if you think you understand what it means to fight for your life against overwhelming odds, you're about to learn why that night changed everything about how law enforcement operates in urban communities. The 6 hours I spent under siege didn't just nearly cost me my life. It exposed a level of police militarization that shocked the entire country and led to congressional investigations that are still ongoing today. Before we go deeper, let me be absolutely clear about why I'm sharing this story. I'm not here to justify gang activity or portray criminals as victims. I'm here to expose what happens when law enforcement becomes indistinguishable from military occupation, when constitutional rights disappear in the name of fighting crime. For 4 years, I was an active member of the Grape Street Watts Crips, involved in drug dealing, territorial disputes, and the kind of street-level violence that plagued South Central during the late 1990s. I was a criminal, and I don't deny that or try to excuse my actions. But what happened during Operation Iron Fist wasn't law enforcement. It was state-sanctioned violence that violated every principle of constitutional policing and human rights. The raid was supposed to target a major drug operation, but it turned into a massacre that killed people who weren't even involved in criminal activity, wounded innocent bystanders, and terrorized an entire community. I survived that night, but 12 of my friends didn't, and the trauma of watching them die in what can only be described as an execution has haunted me for over 20 years. This isn't a story about gang members versus police. It's a story about what happens when the line between law enforcement and warfare completely disappears. I grew up in the Watts neighborhood during the crack epidemic, when gang membership offered one of the few paths to respect, protection, and economic opportunity for young black men. My mother worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner, and my father was serving a life sentence for armed robbery, leaving me to navigate the streets without guidance or supervision. The Grape Street Crips weren't just a gang in our area. They were the dominant economic and social force, controlling drug markets, settling disputes, and providing a form of community organization that filled the vacuum left by absent government services. I joined when I was 15, attracted by the brotherhood, the respect, and the money that came with being part of the most powerful set in Watts. By 19, I was a trusted soldier, involved in drug distribution, territorial enforcement, and the constant conflicts with rival blood sets that defined daily life in our neighborhood. I thought I understood the risks: arrest, imprisonment, death at the hands of rivals. I never imagined that the greatest threat would come from the police force that was supposed to serve and protect our community. The night of March 23, 2001, taught me that sometimes the most dangerous gang in the neighborhood wears badges and operates with government authority. The events that led to Operation Iron Fist began months before the actual raid, when federal drug enforcement agencies identified what they believed was a major narcotics distribution network operating out of several houses in Grape Street Crip territory. The investigation, codenamed Operation Iron Fist, involved months of surveillance, undercover purchases, and intelligence gathering that painted our set as one of the most significant drug operations on the West Coast. What the investigators didn't understand, or chose to ignore, was that the major distribution network was actually just the normal economic activity of a neighborhood where legitimate opportunities were scarce, and drug dealing was one of the few available sources of income. The houses they identified as major distribution centers were just regular homes where people lived, worked, and tried to survive in an environment that offered few alternatives to illegal activity. The sophisticated criminal organization they described in their reports was really just a loose collection of young men trying to make money and protect their territory using the only methods available to them. But the federal agencies needed to justify the massive resources they had invested in the investigation, and they needed high-profile arrests to demonstrate their effectiveness in the war on drugs. The truth about our actual operations was less important than the narrative they had constructed about a major criminal enterprise that needed to be destroyed. The planning phase of Operation Iron Fist revealed the extent to which law enforcement had become militarized in response to the war on drugs and urban gang violence. The operation involved over 200 officers from multiple agencies, including LAPD SWAT teams, federal drug enforcement agents, ATF officers, and even National Guard units that had been borrowed for the raid. The weapons and equipment used in the operation were military-grade, automatic rifles, flashbang grenades, armored vehicles, and even a helicopter gunship that provided aerial support during the assault. The rules of engagement were more appropriate for a battlefield than a residential neighborhood. Officers were authorized to use lethal force against anyone who posed a threat, and the definition of threat was broad enough to include anyone who failed to immediately comply with orders. The briefings before the raid emphasized the dangerous nature of the targets and the need for overwhelming force to prevent casualties among law enforcement personnel. What they didn't emphasize was the likelihood that such overwhelming force would result in casualties among the people they were supposed to arrest, or the possibility that innocent residents might be caught in the crossfire. The operation was planned like a military assault on enemy territory, not a law enforcement action in an American neighborhood. The night before the raid, I was staying at a house on Grape Street that served as both a residence and a location for our drug operations. There were 12 of us in the house that night. Some were active gang members involved in drug dealing. Others were just friends and family members who happened to be there when the raid began. We had no advance warning of what was coming, no intelligence about the months of surveillance that had been conducted, no idea that we had been classified as high-value targets in a major federal operation. The house was a typical South Central residence, small, overcrowded, and filled with people who had nowhere else to go. We were playing cards, watching television, and engaging in the kind of normal social activities that happen in any household. Some of the guys were packaging drugs for sale the next day, but most of us were just hanging out, enjoying each other's company, and trying to forget about the stress and danger of street life for a few hours. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly. We felt safe in our own neighborhood, protected by our reputation and the loyalty of our community. We had no idea that we were about to become targets in what would be remembered as one of the most controversial police operations in Los Angeles history. The raid began at 4:47 a.m. with an explosion that shattered every window in the house and threw all of us to the floor. The flashbang grenades that SWAT teams use to disorient suspects are designed to create temporary blindness and deafness, but in the confined space of a small house, they created a level of sensory overload that was truly terrifying. Before we could even understand what was happening, armed officers were pouring through every door and window, screaming commands that were impossible to hear over the ringing in our ears and impossible to follow in the chaos and confusion of the moment. The level of violence was immediate and overwhelming. Officers were shooting first and asking questions later, treating every movement as a threat and every person as a potential killer. Within the first 60 seconds of the raid, 3 of my friends were dead, shot multiple times by officers who claimed they were reaching for weapons that were never found. The rest of us were forced to the ground at gunpoint, handcuffed and separated, while the house was systematically destroyed in a search for evidence that would justify the level of force that had been used. The raid, that was supposed to last 30 minutes, had turned into a 6-hour siege that would leave 12 people dead and change policing in America forever. The first phase of the raid, from 4:47 a.m. to 6 a.m., was characterized by confusion, panic, and a level of violence that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who were participating in the operation. The SWAT teams had been trained to expect armed resistance from a sophisticated criminal organization, but what they found was a group of young men who were more confused than dangerous, more scared than threatening. The disconnect between the intelligence briefings and the reality on the ground should have led to a de-escalation of force, but instead it seemed to increase the paranoia and aggression of the officers involved. Every unexpected movement was interpreted as an attack. Every attempt to comply with contradictory orders was seen as resistance, and every expression of fear or confusion was treated as evidence of guilt. The officers were operating in a state of heightened alert that made rational decision-making almost impossible, and their training had emphasized the use of overwhelming force rather than de-escalation techniques. The result was a bloodbath that could have been avoided if the operation had been planned as a law enforcement action rather than a military assault. By 6 a.m., 6 people were dead, 15 were wounded, and the house had been turned into a war zone that bore no resemblance to a crime scene. The second phase of the operation, from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., was marked by the arrival of supervisors and federal agents who began to realize that the raid had gone horribly wrong. The body count was already higher than anyone had anticipated, and the evidence being recovered didn't justify the level of violence that had been used. The drugs found in the house were significant but not extraordinary, certainly not enough to warrant a military-style assault that had resulted in multiple deaths. The weapons recovered were mostly handguns and a few rifles, typical for any gang-involved household, but hardly the arsenal of automatic weapons that had been described in the intelligence briefings. Most disturbing of all, several of the people who had been killed were not even active gang members. They were family members, girlfriends, and friends who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The supervisors on scene began to realize that they were dealing with a public relations disaster that could destroy careers and lead to massive civil rights lawsuits. The decision was made to continue the operation and try to find enough evidence to justify what had already happened, rather than stopping the violence and trying to minimize further casualties. This decision would prove to be a fatal mistake that cost 6 more lives and exposed the operation to even greater scrutiny. The third phase of the raid, from 8 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., was the most controversial and legally questionable part of the entire operation. With 6 people already dead and the initial objectives of the raid essentially complete, supervisors made the decision to expand the operation to include neighboring houses and vehicles in an attempt to find additional evidence that would justify the level of force that had been used. This expansion of the raid beyond the original scope violated numerous legal and procedural guidelines, but the commanders on scene were more concerned with covering their mistakes than following proper protocols. The additional searches resulted in 6 more deaths, including 2 people who were not even gang members, but were killed because they happened to be visiting friends in the neighborhood. The level of violence during this phase was even more extreme than during the initial assault, as officers became increasingly frustrated by their inability to find the major drug operation that had been described in the intelligence reports. The desperation to justify the operation led to increasingly aggressive tactics, including the use of excessive force against people who were already in custody, and the destruction of property that had no connection to criminal activity. By 10:30 a.m., it was clear that Operation Iron Fist had become a massacre rather than a law enforcement operation. The final phase of the raid, from 10:30 a.m. until the operation was officially terminated at 11:15 a.m., was characterized by a frantic attempt to control the narrative and minimize the political fallout from what had become an obvious disaster. Media crews had arrived on scene and were broadcasting live coverage of the aftermath, showing body bags being removed from houses and wounded suspects being taken to hospitals under heavy guard. Community leaders were demanding answers, civil rights organizations were calling for federal investigations, and politicians were distancing themselves from an operation that had clearly violated constitutional principles and basic human rights. The commanders on scene were faced with the impossible task of explaining how a routine drug raid had resulted in 12 deaths and 37 injuries, most of them among people who posed no immediate threat to law enforcement. The evidence recovered during the 6-hour operation was substantial but not extraordinary, certainly not enough to justify the military-style assault that had been conducted. The official reports would later describe Operation Iron Fist as a successful law enforcement action that had dismantled a major criminal organization, but the reality was that it had been a massacre that exposed the dangers of militarized policing in urban communities. The immediate aftermath of Operation Iron Fist was chaos and confusion as law enforcement agencies, political leaders, and community organizations tried to understand what had happened and why. The official death toll was 12 gang members killed and 37 wounded, but these numbers didn't tell the whole story of the violence that had occurred. Several of the people killed were not active gang members, but were family members or friends who had been visiting the targeted houses. The wounded included not only suspects, but also innocent bystanders who had been caught in the crossfire or injured during the aggressive searches that followed the initial assault. The level of property damage was extensive, with multiple houses destroyed or severely damaged by the use of military-grade weapons and explosive devices. The psychological trauma inflicted on the community was immeasurable, as residents realized that their neighborhood had been treated like enemy territory by the police force that was supposed to protect them. The operation had achieved its stated objective of disrupting drug operations in the area, but the cost in human life and community trust was far higher than anyone had anticipated or could justify. The legal and political consequences of Operation Iron Fist began almost immediately and continued for years afterward. Civil rights organizations filed multiple lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the raid and seeking damages for the families of those killed and wounded. Congressional hearings were held to investigate the use of military tactics and equipment in domestic law enforcement operations. The Department of Justice launched its own investigation into possible civil rights violations by the officers and agencies involved in the raid. Media coverage of the operation sparked a national debate about the militarization of police forces and the erosion of constitutional protections in the war on drugs. Several officers were eventually charged with excessive use of force, though most were acquitted or received minimal sentences. The agencies involved implemented new policies and procedures designed to prevent similar incidents, but critics argued that these changes were cosmetic rather than substantive. The families of the victims received financial settlements, but no amount of money could compensate for the lives lost or the trauma inflicted on the community. The operation became a case study in how not to conduct law enforcement operations in urban communities, but it also demonstrated the difficulty of holding police accountable for excessive use of force. My personal experience during Operation Iron Fist was a 6-hour nightmare that changed my understanding of law enforcement, constitutional rights, and the value of human life in America. I watched friends die in front of me, saw innocent people treated like enemy combatants, and experienced a level of state-sanctioned violence that I had never imagined possible in a democratic society. The physical injuries I sustained during the raid, a broken arm, multiple contusions, and temporary hearing loss from the flashbang grenades, healed within months. The psychological trauma took years to address and continues to affect my daily life more than 20 years later. The survivor's guilt of living through an experience that killed 12 other people is something that never completely goes away. The anger at a system that could authorize such violence against its own citizens is a constant source of motivation for the work I do now. But perhaps most importantly, the experience taught me that the line between law enforcement and military occupation is thinner than most people realize, and that constitutional rights are only as strong as the willingness of citizens to defend them against government overreach. The community response to Operation Iron Fist was immediate and sustained, reflecting the deep trauma and anger that the raid had created throughout south-central Los Angeles. Protests began within hours of the operation and continued for weeks, with thousands of residents demanding accountability for the deaths and injuries that had occurred. Community leaders organized vigils for the victims, legal defense funds for the survivors, and political action committees to push for police reform. The operation had united the community in a way that years of gang violence and social problems had not, creating a shared sense of victimization and determination to prevent similar incidents in the future. Churches, schools, and community organizations worked together to provide counseling and support services for residents who had been traumatized by the violence. The economic impact on the neighborhood was severe, as businesses closed and property values plummeted in response to the negative publicity and ongoing tensions with law enforcement. But the community also demonstrated remarkable resilience and solidarity, coming together to heal and rebuild in the aftermath of the tragedy. The legacy of Operation Iron Fist became a rallying point for police reform efforts that continue to this day. The media coverage of Operation Iron Fist played a crucial role in shaping public understanding of the incident and its broader implications for policing in America. The live television coverage of the raid's aftermath brought the reality of militarized policing into homes across the country, showing viewers the level of violence that had been used against American citizens in an urban neighborhood. The images of body bags, destroyed houses, and wounded suspects under heavy guard created a powerful visual narrative that contradicted official claims about the success of the operation. Investigative reporting in the weeks and months following the raid revealed the extent to which intelligence had been exaggerated, procedures had been violated, and constitutional rights had been ignored. The coverage also highlighted the racial and economic dimensions of the incident, noting that such military-style operations were almost exclusively conducted in poor communities of color rather than affluent white neighborhoods. The media attention kept the story in the public consciousness long enough for meaningful investigations and reforms to be implemented, though critics argued that the coverage also sensationalized the violence and contributed to negative stereotypes about urban communities. The long-term impact of Operation Iron Fist on law enforcement practices and policies was significant but incomplete. The incident led to new guidelines for the use of military equipment and tactics in domestic law enforcement operations, including requirements for additional oversight and approval before conducting large-scale raids. Training programs were modified to emphasize de-escalation techniques and constitutional protections, though critics argued that these changes were insufficient to address the underlying culture of militarization that had made the incident possible. The operation became a case study in police academies and law enforcement training programs, used as an example of how not to conduct urban operations. Federal funding for military equipment transfers to local police departments was temporarily reduced, though it was later restored and expanded. The incident contributed to a broader national conversation about police reform that continues today, but it also demonstrated the difficulty of creating meaningful change in law enforcement culture and practices. The families of the victims and survivors continue to advocate for additional reforms, arguing that the lessons of Operation Iron Fist have not been fully learned or implemented. The psychological and social impact of Operation Iron Fist on the survivors and the broader community cannot be overstated. For those of us who lived through the 6-hour siege, the experience created trauma that affects every aspect of daily life. The sound of helicopters, the sight of police officers in tactical gear, even unexpected loud noises can trigger flashbacks and panic attacks that transport us back to that morning in March 2001. The survivor's guilt of living through an experience that killed so many others creates a constant sense of responsibility to honor their memory and ensure that their deaths were not meaningless. The anger at a system that could authorize such violence is balanced by the determination to work for change and prevent similar incidents in the future. For the broader community, the operation created a lasting mistrust of law enforcement that affects every interaction between residents and police officers. Children who witnessed the aftermath of the raid grew up with a fundamentally different understanding of police authority and constitutional rights. The social fabric of the neighborhood was permanently altered by the shared trauma of the experience, creating bonds of solidarity, but also divisions between those who wanted to fight the system and those who wanted to work within it for change. The legal proceedings that followed Operation Iron Fist were complex and often frustrating for the families of the victims and the survivors of the raid. Multiple civil rights lawsuits were filed against the agencies and officers involved, seeking both financial compensation and policy changes to prevent similar incidents. The criminal prosecution of officers was limited and largely unsuccessful, with most defendants being acquitted or receiving minimal sentences that did not reflect the severity of their actions. The civil cases were more successful, resulting in millions of dollars in settlements for the families of those killed and wounded during the operation. But the legal process also revealed the difficulty of holding law enforcement accountable for excessive use of force, as qualified immunity protections and police union contracts created numerous obstacles to meaningful prosecution. The congressional hearings that followed the incident produced extensive documentation of what had gone wrong, but limited concrete action to address the underlying problems. The Department of Justice investigation resulted in some policy changes, but no criminal charges against the senior officials who had authorized the operation. The legal legacy of Operation Iron Fist is a mixed record of partial accountability and incomplete justice that continues to frustrate advocates for police reform. The personal transformation that I underwent as a result of surviving Operation Iron Fist was gradual but profound. The experience forced me to confront the reality of my involvement in gang activities and the harm that I had caused to my community through drug dealing and violence. But it also opened my eyes to the broader systems of oppression and injustice that had shaped my life and the lives of everyone in my neighborhood. The anger I felt at the police violence I had witnessed was channeled into a determination to work for change and prevent other young people from experiencing similar trauma. I began working with community organizations that focused on police accountability and criminal justice reform, using my experience as a survivor to advocate for policy changes and support other victims of police violence. The work was difficult and often frustrating as progress was slow and setbacks were frequent. But it also gave my survival a sense of purpose and meaning that helped me deal with the guilt and trauma of the experience. The skills I had developed as a gang member, leadership, strategic thinking, the ability to organize and motivate others, could be used for positive purposes if I was willing to change my perspective and priorities. The work I do now focuses on police accountability, criminal justice reform, and supporting communities that have been affected by excessive use of force. I speak at conferences, universities, and community meetings about my experience during Operation Iron Fist and the broader issues of militarized policing and constitutional rights. I work with legal organizations that represent victims of police violence, helping them navigate the complex process of seeking justice and compensation for their losses. I also work with law enforcement agencies that are genuinely committed to reform, helping them understand the community impact of their operations and develop better practices for urban policing. The work is challenging because it requires me to maintain relationships with both police reform advocates and law enforcement officials, groups that often view each other with suspicion and hostility. But it's also rewarding because it allows me to use my experience to prevent other communities from experiencing the kind of trauma that Operation Iron Fist inflicted on South Central Los Angeles. Every policy change that results from this work, every officer who learns to de-escalate rather than escalate, every community that avoids a similar tragedy, these are the victories that make the ongoing struggle worthwhile. The broader implications of Operation Iron Fist for American democracy and constitutional rights extend far beyond the specific incident and its immediate aftermath. The operation demonstrated how easily constitutional protections can be suspended in the name of fighting crime, and how military tactics and equipment can be used against American citizens with minimal oversight or accountability. The incident occurred during a period of increasing militarization of domestic law enforcement, driven by the war on drugs, concerns about terrorism, and the availability of surplus military equipment from overseas conflicts. The lessons of Operation Iron Fist are relevant to current debates about police reform, constitutional rights, and the appropriate role of law enforcement in a democratic society. The incident shows what can happen when police departments are given military equipment and training without adequate oversight or accountability mechanisms. It demonstrates the importance of community input in law enforcement policies and the need for transparency in police operations. Most importantly, it illustrates the human cost of treating American neighborhoods like enemy territory and American citizens like enemy combatants. The legacy of Operation Iron Fist is a reminder that constitutional rights are fragile and must be actively defended against government overreach. Before I finish my story, I need something from you. If this video has impacted you in any way, if it's made you think differently about police accountability, about constitutional rights, about the militarization of law enforcement, I need you to share it. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone in your family who doesn't understand why police reform is necessary. Maybe it's a friend who thinks that excessive force is justified in fighting crime. Maybe it's a community leader who's looking for ways to improve police-community relations. Your share could help prevent another Operation Iron Fist. Your comment could reach someone who's been affected by police violence and needs to know they're not alone. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need to understand that constitutional rights are only as strong as our willingness to defend them, that police accountability is essential for democracy, and that communities have the power to demand better from their law enforcement agencies. I also want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your thoughts, your experiences, your questions, whether you agree with everything I've said or not, whether my story resonates with you or challenges you. I want to know. This conversation doesn't end when the video stops. It continues in the comments, in the discussions you have with your families, in the choices you make when faced with opportunities to support police reform or hold law enforcement accountable. So please, take a moment right now to engage with this content. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And together, we can create change that prevents other communities from experiencing the kind of trauma that Operation Iron Fist inflicted on South Central Los Angeles. Share your own experiences with law enforcement. Tell me about times when you've seen police accountability in action, or ask questions about how to get involved in police reform efforts. The more we talk about these issues openly and honestly, the more we can work together to build a justice system that serves all communities fairly and constitutionally. To anyone watching this who works in law enforcement, who supports police officers, or who believes that strong law enforcement is necessary for public safety, I want you to know that this story is not an attack on all police officers or the concept of law enforcement. There are many dedicated, professional officers who serve their communities with honor and integrity, who would never participate in the kind of operation that I survived. But there are also systemic problems in American policing that make incidents like Operation Iron Fist possible, and these problems need to be addressed through meaningful reform rather than denial or defensiveness. The militarization of police forces, the lack of accountability for excessive use of force, the erosion of constitutional protections in the name of fighting crime. These are issues that affect all communities and threaten the principles of democratic governance. Police officers who are committed to serving and protecting their communities should be the strongest advocates for reform, because they understand better than anyone the damage that bad policing does to police-community relations and public safety. The goal is not to eliminate law enforcement, but to ensure that it operates within constitutional boundaries and serves all communities fairly and effectively. My name is Terrell, and I survived Operation Iron Fist, the deadliest police raid in South Central history. Today, I choose to be known as someone who uses that experience to advocate for police accountability and constitutional rights, who believes in the possibility of reform and the importance of community engagement in law enforcement policies. This is my story, my testimony, and my warning about what happens when law enforcement becomes indistinguishable from military occupation. The 12 people who died during that raid were not heroes or villains. They were human beings whose lives had value, whose deaths were unnecessary, and whose memory deserves to be honored through meaningful change. The 37 people who were wounded, including myself, carry the physical and psychological scars of that experience every day, but we also carry the responsibility to ensure that their suffering was not meaningless. If this video has impacted you, please don't just watch and move on. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts, your story, or your questions. Your engagement helps this message reach more people, and your voice adds to the conversation that can prevent future tragedies. Remember, constitutional rights are only as strong as our willingness to defend them. Police accountability is essential for democracy, and every person has the power to demand better from their government. Thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of the solution. Stay vigilant, demand accountability, and never let fear silence your voice in the fight for justice.